theatre voice. So, I've been enjoying Poland, so I apologise if my voice disappears because it might have been the karaoke at 3 in the morning that did it, not me, promise. Cool, so in this talk we're all going to get angry, and hopefully we're going to get angry with me and not angry at me. But if you're angry at me and want to throw things, that's okay. I'm very, very used to it. Okay, before we start, does anyone in here contribute to open source software? 1, 2, awesome, right. So it's the both of you that I'm scared of. Okay, so I don't really have a title for this talk that works because that one's really, really combative. Open source exploitation. It's horrible and it's difficult, and it's because all the titles that I tried to come up with felt so relentlessly negative that I honestly just didn't want to use them. Now, I promise this talk isn't about being negative. It's a talk about the work that we have to do to be better as a software industry. And as someone that doesn't really believe in hills or like walking up them or death or dying, I think this is probably the hill I'm going to die on. So I want to talk to you today about how open source has, in most cases, been turned into exploitation by the biggest organizations in the world, how it's used to extricate free labor from you, and why it's fundamentally a bad thing. I'm going to talk about how we can do better. I'm going to talk about what needs to change to make software, and especially open source, something that I personally love dearly as the other person that ships open source in the room. I want to help it survive. Because right now I kind of feel like open source is in the most precarious place that it's ever been in its entire existence, and I feel like hardly anyone is really talking about it. It's weird. So to anyone that's not met me, I appreciate that I'm somewhat conspicuous. I've written a few kids' books about programming. I built some web scale things. It's not very interesting. But the important thing is that I'm a programmer at heart, and I've been programming for 30 years now. And I kind of think this talk is one of the most important things I've written in my career. And I don't know if you're going to like it, and I don't know if you're going to care by the end of this, but let's talk about open source. So, before I start with the gory details, I want to talk about love and loving things and what that really means. So more importantly, let's talk about how it's important to understand that you can be critical of something that you love because you want it to be better, not because you want to harm it. So I've been building open source software since the actual 1990s, when the internet was a village and everything was really, really tiny, actually. The culture was very different. And, I was tiny. And it's important to understand that on my journey towards maturity, myself as a human, and the techniques and opinions and approaches that help you get from A to B, and not necessarily the things that are going to get you from B to C. And people frequently struggle with the fact that their aesthetic viewpoints and their opinions have to change when the context around them changes. Humans are these kind of beautiful and often simple creatures that presume because something has worked before, that it's going to work again, regardless of context. So as technologists and as an industry, we're going to have to embrace this change if we want open source to survive. Now, open source won the fight, right? That's like a common thing that you'll hear everybody talk about. You kind of probably know this to be true, right? You probably use Visual Studio Code as a text editor. As of 2018, and that's now, 7 years ago, 40% of VMs on Microsoft Azure were Linux containers. Right, open source won the hearts and minds of people by telling them that software could and should be free. But I don't think it really spent enough time explaining what free really meant, because everything has a cost. And while the GPL and its variants were probably the first permissive and free software licenses, they were the licenses that rapidly gained mindshare with the rising popularity of Linux in the late 90s. And Linux really was kind of the tip of the spear of open source. It pushed open source into the mainstream, and its GPL license was originally described by the Free Software Foundation as free as in speech, not free as in beer. And I appreciate I'm probably in a room not of native English speakers, and that's a pretty confusing sentence if you don't really think about it. It was kind of confounding to most people, and people struggled to understand what the intent behind that phrase was. So what does the GPL really mean? In simple terms, if you use source code available under its license, you need to make your changes public for other people to use. And this is because the Free Software Foundation believed in software freedoms, literally the right of the software to be liberated, so that its users could then modify, inspect, and make their own changes to it. So free was like freedom, like, you know, and the truth is, you know, that's a noble goal. I get it. Like, especially if you think about the context of the 1990s, where no software was really that free, even the Unixes of the time. I think really it shows the GPL's lineage as a license used to build Linux. And, you know, and really what Linux is a Unix clone that was meant to be free for the students that couldn't afford to pay a Unix license, right? And really it was centered around people sharing source code at local computing clubs because the internet was a village, right? We were all peers in that room. So it's really, really important to stress that free never meant free from cost. It never meant free at the point of consumption. It meant free as in freedom. And in fact, much of the original literature focuses on this by describing software that is free from cost and free at the point of consumption as gratis. Now, not all free software uses the GPL, right? And this is a direct quote from the license preamble on the page itself. So no, there are many other free software licenses. We have an incomplete list. Any license that provides the user certain specific freedoms is a free software license. Why should I use the GNU GPL rather than other licenses? Well, using it requires that all released improved versions of software be free software. This means you can avoid the risk of having to compete with proprietary modified versions of your own work. Remember that sentence, it's kind of useful later. However, in some special situations, it can be better to use a more permissive license. So, you know, the GPL understood what it was from the very start, even if the users didn't necessarily. But it wasn't really that version of free software that actually did win the fight at all, right? And people like to talk about the GPL and copyleft, but it's really something for enthusiasts. The truth is that despite Linux, and despite the early and limited forays into open source by organizations like Red Hat, and strong copyleft licenses of the GPL were not the reason that free software and open source resonated with people. It's not the reason open source won. They're certainly not the reasons that ultra mega massive corps like Microsoft or Amazon or Google are now champions of open source, right? The widespread adoption of open source software in enterprise is directly related to the MIT license and the Apache permissive licenses. And that's because those licenses explicitly do not force people to build on top of the software to reshare their modifications back to the wider community. Kind of the opposite of the Free Software Foundation's version of open source, really. So, permissive licensing allows individuals and organizations to take your work, build on top of it, and then operate those copies of the software for profit. All right. So much like the GPL, the aim of open source was not to restrict commercial exploitation, right? But to ensure the freedom of the software itself. So, who is it that benefits from permissive licensing? If Amazon take your library and host it as a service and charge money for it? Trick question, really. I'll tell you this, in any situation where there's a power imbalance, let's say between the 4 or 5 biggest organizations in the entire world and like some person writing some code that they put on the internet, the organization is always going to win, right? There is no, you have no chance, there is no hope. So, open source literally just won because of permissive licenses, right? And without wanting to sound like a naysayer, because I assure you, again, I deeply love open source and software freedom and the combined value that those two things give and allow us to teach our peers and each other, I cannot say louder than this. Multinational corporations do not give one single solitary fuck about you. right? Businesses do not care. They do not care. But I'll tell you what they do care about. They care about free value, right? And the word value is kind of like a sneaky term, really, isn't it? Because they care about this free value that they're able to commercially exploit. And the wide proliferation of software in businesses is a direct result of licenses like the Apache license, like the MIT license, being leveraged into closed source, proprietary, and for-profit work. That's all it is. Want to test this theory? If you don't believe me, right? I want you to go into your office tomorrow or Monday and try and add some GPL code and test your company's compliance and licensing division and see how that goes for you. See how your manager responds first, and then see how corporate respond, and then see how your lawyers respond. Permissive licenses, explicitly and without recourse, shift the balance of power towards large technical organizations and away from authors and creators. They do it precisely because large organizations have the might to leverage the code, they have the capability to build on top of it, and they have the funding to exploit it. They have the incentives and organizational structures to profit from doing so, whereas individuals do not. So open source software took a hold of the enterprise because it allowed itself to be exploited. Now, I see the cogs turning sometimes when I do this, and people like, exploitation's a pretty heavy word, isn't it? Like, that's like really, really bad stuff that happens to people. Yeah, okay. Let's read it. The action or fact of treating someone unfairly in order to benefit from their work. Shit. The act of making use of or benefiting from resources. I hate it when we call people resources. The fact of making use of a situation to gain unfair advantage for oneself. Seems like we're fucked, really. And you know, well, I get it. It sounds like a pretty negative slant. Surely that's not fair. Surely these talented people that publish open source, this is me, right, are smarter than to just let their work get picked up and exploited by organizations. But, you know, has anyone seen this before? I feel like everyone's seen this picture before, right? This is just the truth, right? It's so widely reported, right, that the vast majority of open source projects aren't funded, even important ones. There's no art without patronage. None, never has been. The only successful open source projects in the world are either A, backed by enormous companies that use them for strategic marketing and product positioning advantage. That would be Visual Studio Code. You are the product. Or B, rely on the exploitation of free labor for the gain of the organizations operating these products as services. Elasticsearch. And I can kind of feel people frothing a little bit, but, you know, GitHub donations are a thing. You know, what about Patreon? I donated once. And it's like, you know, when I see people say things like that, they kind of undermine their own arguments, right? Because what you're really saying there is we have charity. Surely that's enough, right? And we all watch people burn out. And we've watched people trying to do dual licensing, and we've watched those same people get shouted down on Hacker News and Reddit for pulling a bait and switch. Right? We've seen people get criticized by their peers for not being free enough for them, while those same peers use their work to profit. We watch people go to the effort of and the legal legwork of setting up support entities to sell support contracts and then have single-digit numbers of license sales. You know, we've seen packages with 20 million downloads languish because nobody is willing to pay for the actual work. It's just this hellscape that victimizes creators. I would not wish a successful open source project on anybody. So I obviously asked Reddit about this. Always a big mistake. So I recently made the observation in a Reddit thread that it's utterly wild that I can turn my webcam on and I can stream myself on YouTube or Twitch reading out the code from an open source code base for entertainment, and people will happily send me donations. But if the open source author did that, they would like yell them off the stage, right? And I thought, God, it's really weird that I can profit from this, but the open source community has become so wrong-headed that the idea of charging for the software is anathema to them. So here are the direct quotes. Let's read them out. Oh, so you hate GCC and Linux too, since they're developed by and for companies. And didn't really say that, did I? Arguing against free software, what year is it? Well, again, kind of love free software. It's free, why wouldn't it be free for everyone? That includes organizations. I'm honestly not clear what you're suggesting specifically and logistically. Well, fuck me. Again, people that treat organizations like they're people are a bit depressing. So obviously I was downvoted into oblivion because people seem to interpret the phrase, perhaps multinational organizations should pay you for your work, as I don't think software freedom is a good idea. Weird. But I was more astonished by people suggesting, actually, that charging for software was somehow in contradiction with the ethos of open source, when all that position really shows is like an astonishing lack of literacy in what open source really means. Like, and you want to know how you know when someone doesn't have a good point to make? It's when they say, oh, it looks kind of funny, or it feels kind of funny. It just means you don't have a good critique of the position. So I want to tell you a story about music. And I'm looking around the room, and actually only about a third of the room is probably old enough to remember this, which is terrifying. So in 1999, the last millennium, Napster heralded the popularization of peer-to-peer file sharing. And Metallica, in their bad haircut era, litigated. They sued them, and they were absolutely vilified for suing them. Now, the music business at the time in the late 90s had become this corporate fat cat, nickel and diming everybody for the prices of CDs were exorbitant. So £20 in 1999 money is probably like 40 euros for a CD, right? Insane. And, bands were filthy rich and record executives even richer. And we all cried, what do Metallica know about this? They're rich already. Why do they want to sue the people that are giving us free music? We just want new music, man. So I spent my mid-teens in the late 90s pirating music on Napster and Audio Galaxy and LimeWire and Kazaa and Direct Connect hubs. Anywhere I could steal music from, I stole music from. And you know what? If anyone had actually spent time listening to exactly what Lars Ulrich, the drummer of Metallica, actually said at the time, they'd realize he was absolutely 100% correct and has been 100% vindicated in all the years since, in the 2 decades, right? So I read an interview with him recently where he looks back on this, and he's super reflective, and here is what he actually said at the time. What we're doing is we're devaluing the work of musicians. It doesn't affect me at all, but it's going to affect every single band that comes after me. I'm already a multimillionaire. File sharing fundamentally devalues the work, and once it's done, it can never be undone. Oh boy, yeah. Called it, right? Honestly. After 1999, the music business was never the same. Small touring bands that would make a comfortable living scrape by in the 2020s. Niche and underground genres, while more vibrant than ever creatively, absolutely cannot financially sustain themselves. I have lots and lots of friends in mid-sized touring bands that work day jobs. And, these are bands with million Spotify monthly listeners. Right? It just doesn't scale. We devalued the work by giving it all away. And when you give it all away, the only people that profit are the large organizations that are in power, like Spotify. And Spotify today, they occupy the space that music labels once did, a vastly profitable large organization, while artists figuratively and sometimes literally starve. And then they fucking fire all their tech workers, because, I don't know, we're waste too, right? So, yeah. I wish I had Lars Ulrich's fine wine cellar and art collection, but forgive me for not feeling a little bit like I'm basically just standing here desperately hoping that somebody listens to this message, because we are here, right now. I love open source. There's my voice. It was only Toto's Africa. Just like, Lars loved the tape trading scene in the 80s in underground heavy metal. And it's funny because he came from that exact background, just a technology era once removed. But the ways in which we allow ourselves to be weaponized and we allow our works to be weaponized against us is kind of a violence. It doesn't put humans and maintainers and creators and authors at the center, right? Instead, it sets out organizational exploitation as a goal because open source wanted to become popular. It wanted to win. But we made this tragic mistake of thinking that the ownership model that was good for our local computing club, just like the ownership model that was good in the tape trading scene in the 80s, could scale to planet-size organizations. Okay, so a bit of a confessional. How did we get here? This is the really scary part. We got here because it's what we wanted. It's what we wanted to do. I did this. You all, well, maybe not all of you, but some of you did this. We all made these mistakes, right? So I spent the last decade and a half, advocating for the adoption of open source in mid to large organizations. And I, myself, sat and wrote policies suggesting that while we needed to adopt and contribute, if we could, largely organizations never do, we needed to contribute to open source because for both strategic and marketing benefits, right? And we should really only look at permissively licensed software because that way we wouldn't be forced to put it back into the public domain. I was so wrong. I did that. I wrote that policy in about 3 different businesses. And this is my penance, I think. I'm sorry, and I let everyone down. I honestly believe that, and I think I should have instead spent that time advocating that we licensed dual license software, that we bought the support contracts, that we participated in copyleft software and actually gave back to the community. But I don't think I had the intellectual maturity at the time to see the thing as it really was. And that's what I do now, right? That's what I do now in my day job. But this is the problem, right? It's not just me. I know it's just me. I know it's not just me. So every time a small organization or creator tries to license their software in a way that protects them from the exploitation of big business, so this happened recently to Elasticsearch, it happened recently to Apollo, the GraphQL client, numerous other examples over the years, right? HashiCorp is the most recent example. The community just fucking savages them, right? Without realizing that it's like a self-harm. The community is just savaging itself. What we're really doing when we do that is saying we don't want you to succeed, my peer, right? And we really need to be better at supporting each other, at knowing that whenever a creator cries burnout, or that they can't pay their rent in fucking NPM downloads, that what they really, and in some cases when they have to advertise for jobs in install scripts. Have you seen this happen? They mean it, and that it's really coming from a place of panic, and actually it could be you next. You could be the next person. So here's what I believe. I think we need new licenses, and I think we need new culture, one that prioritizes the freedom of people from exploitation over the freedom of software, right? I think that's what the freedom should mean now. I want you all to get paid. That sounds like a really if you take one thing away from this talk, I just want you all to get paid, right? I want you to have nice things. I want you to work sustainably, and I want a world where it's viable for smart people to run small boutique businesses building little beautiful things and to make a good living because they're doing something valuable. And that to me was always the dream of open source. If we have to operate inside this late stage capitalistic hellhole, I want it to be on our terms that we interact with it. Now, this isn't just a single contributor problem, ironically. So the development community is like this misaligned idea that it has a trust relationship between kind of smaller ISVs, and it's continually conflated with people's love for free at the point of consumption software and open source. And basically these vendors suffer the same outrage as independent maintainers when those expectations are not met. So I think Elastic is the most obvious example of this, where they just kind of said, hey, we'd rather you bought our service off us if you want to host it. You can still have all the bits, obviously, you can do it yourself for open source. We'd just rather Amazon not pick up our entire business and replicate it, right? So, interestingly, last year this flared up in the tools space, right? So the very, very, very closed source tool Postman, an API testing tool, which has like all this, if you go to their website, there's all this marketing brochureware about it having an open source API philosophy, which, if you're taking notes, doesn't mean anything. That sentence is nonsense, right? Like, what does it mean? Anyway, they changed their licensing model to be far more expensive, right? They made the tool unviable to a lot of people, and that resulted in a mass migration to a competing open source tool called Insomnia. And obviously, Insomnia saw these like 500,000 users turn up and swiftly changed their own license to match, right? Requiring logins for users, and then they received the same backlash. So what happened there was a closed source organization changed their licensing, incidentally victimizing an open source creator who tried to protect themselves, and then everyone told them to get screwed. Like, absolute insanity. The mere thought of Insomnia trying to walk towards monetization and sustainability was enough to turn the noses of users who we have just conditioned should get everything for free. And, you know, it's not just API tooling. A similar predictable pattern happened with HashiCorp. So the darling of DevOps, they changed their licensing, resulting in forks and a flurry of support from companies that had never actually contributed back to the HashiCorp code base before. They just seemed to like, oh yeah, we can do that. And you know, the stats don't lie. If you actually look at all those forks that happened, nobody maintained them. It's almost like HashiCorp were doing something valuable, right? You know, the real Terraform a few months on is still getting updated, while OpenTF is supported by like a handful of commits each week. So while it's nice to see the community rise up and say, oh, we can just fork it, we'll fix it, we'll take responsibility, actually, the people that were going to take responsibility already were, right? So, and all this does is kind of perpetuate the same toxic relationship with large organizations, right? It just plays out on a smaller scale. Like, having that same relationship isn't going to fix this problem. So, all right, we've done the doom and gloom. Let's do some kind of fixing stuff. So firstly, can companies ever ethically interact with open source? So, yes, of course they can. Okay, and here's a little bit of light before I talk about what else I think we need to do to address this imbalance. So I think there are companies that do good work in open source, obviously, and they fund it well. They have reasons for doing so, right? And even some of the biggest players have reasonably ethical open source products. But they always do it for a marketing position and for mindshare and ultimately to sell products and services. And I think that's okay. That's a reasonable exchange of value. You're getting something for free. You're effectively giving them your loyalty or service or data. You know, if we're going to interact with organizations, there's nothing wrong with taking and using the software that they make available for free. But just remember that your patronage is the product. And even the projects that you may perceive to be independent, like, okay, Linux, who do you think funds Linux, right? Basically Intel and Microsoft, right? They all have funding structures and staff provided from big organizations, right? And the open source software that you produce, and I need you to remember this, is not the same kind of open source software as the open source software produced by megacorps, right? They're completely different things. And it's kind of foolish to perceive it to be the same thing because you make an invalid comparison. So, okay, how do we change this? How do we fix everything, right? So I think we need better approaches and better systems along with the cooperation of major vendors to really make a dent in this problem, right? And I don't think it's going to be easy, but I think there's a role in this for everybody. So first, and this is like a really, really basic thing we'll start off with, this is the most free of all the ways that we can solve this problem. So the next time each of you is about to send that shitty tweet because Docker Desktop made delaying updates a paid feature, maybe for a second wonder why they might be doing that, right? Honestly. The next time you see a library you like that adopts like an open core model where they have the core of the thing be free but all the plugins are paid for, actually kind of realize you could just pay for those features and they're normally not very expensive for individual users, right? It's valuable work. Whenever a maintainer asks for support or contributions for something you use, like think about actually contributing back. So don't be entitled, don't shout down at your peers, don't troll them for trying to make a living. If we all behaved like this, the software world would be a lot kinder, honestly. I think also we need to rehabilitate package management in general. Like I think it's table stakes for whatever the next iteration of programming environments are to support billing as a first-class concept. I tell you what, I would move to any programming language or tool set in a second that could maintain critical mass with billing as part of the core package delivery process. So I have this theory, right? And my theory is that more organizations would pay for software if there were existing models that supported or allowed it. Most projects couldn't issue an invoice or pay taxes or accept credit cards if they tried, right? It's actually quite hard to pay people for things. I think the next generation platforms need to support this for creator sustainability. And we're kind of seeing the first steps towards those goals with like nascent projects like SDK Bin, like the NuGet but paid. I know it's kind of been in churn for a few years, but I think people are starting to think about this. Actually, I believe NuGet originally had facility for billing built into it, but it was removed, which is an interesting bit of trivia. So a few steps ahead of this, I think actually those same megacorps that rely on us to do work in their frameworks and their tool sets should shoulder the burden of some of this responsibility. I want to pay for libraries that I use in my Azure bill or my AWS bill or my GCP bill. Like I want to remove that first bit where you have to go through procurement, right? And I've kind of railed against these large organizations leveraging open source throughout this talk. But I think that large organizations aren't fundamentally bad. They're amoral, right? They just don't care. But, I believe they always operate in their best interest. And the first platform that allows me to sell packages like they have marketplaces for full software, they can have their cut. I think that's fair. They're helping, they're facilitating. And I think this would unlock a whole category of software sales that they just don't exist in the market today. Imagine instead of having to work through that asinine procurement process, you could just add a NuGet or an NPM or cargo package, and it'll just be accounted for and charged appropriately by your card platform from some private package feed that meters and measures. I think this is actually the best thing these vendors could do to support creators. They could create a real marketplace that's sustainable for everybody inside of it. And I think we should honestly kind of keep fighting for free software or whatever it becomes, for teachers and for users and for your friends. I feel like I need to double down on what I said at the start. Like I love open source software dearly and I want it to survive. But we have to understand that it's got to a place where its success is something that's currently threatening its sustainable existence. Open source doesn't have to be a proxy for the exploitation of the individual. It can be ethical. I can survive this, I think. And obviously, I don't want to take your source code away. And I think that original kind of computer club spirit of sharing code with your friends is awesome and should never stop. I just desperately want to have enough people think critically about it that when it's your great new idea, that you can actually be the person that does something meaningful with it, and you can execute on it, and you can benefit from it. By all means, give it away to your peers, but spare no pity for large organizations that just want to profit from your work at your expense. Now, I know there's a bunch of initiatives at the moment to try and rehabilitate open source licensing, and I think probably that's the first good step towards this. I've seen some people, I think it's Fair Source or something like that, that like people are now actually starting to think about this because this has been increasing over the years, right? And I think ultimately, you know, in music, there's this idea of supporting the scene, right? Because this is our heritage. It's the shared place where the art comes from, where the works come from. This, I think, is our culture. This is the thing that we did that actually changed the world. So I think you should also pay your friends for their software and accept payment gracefully when they want to give it you for free or they want to pay you for your work. Right? I think we should normalize it rather than vilify it. So I want to talk a little bit about charity. So over the past couple of years, as this problem has started to become a bit too big to ignore, we've seen a bunch of alternative funding approaches start to appear. So we've seen people do crowdfunding projects on Kickstarter to mix success. We've seen people operate Patreons for early access releases to software. And we've seen GitHub introduce sponsorship and companies notably occasionally donating, like, I would say large amounts, 5 grand, 10 grand here and there, to open source projects from their own internal funds. And I'll be honest, it really makes me feel very, very conflicted. So a long time ago, I worked in the third sector in the UK, so the charity sector. And I actually worked in a for-profit company operating in the third sector, which was like an interesting thing. And at the end of my tenure there, I was left feeling like excellent charity doesn't excuse a poor welfare state. Right? Charity is what we do when all the other systems around us fail. So while I kind of applaud creators who are making grassroots efforts to work on their funding techniques and make sure that they work for them, I think almost uniformly by effectively charging for licenses to software. That's what all these things really are. It's just software licensing with a different name written on the top of the door. And, you know, I think Kickstarter and Patreon are probably the thinner end of the wedge because it readdresses some of these problems and people are kind of normalized to the crowdfunding models these days. But I think the truth is those same things come with a lot of problematic elements where what they really do is they ask more of creators than just for the work, right? And they often form the basis of these like weird parasocial relationships with creators that only fuel consumer entitlement to the humans behind the software itself. And, you know, frankly, with all respect to Microsoft, GitHub sponsorships are like literally the absolute least they could possibly do in this space. Like literally the least. And I think companies spending some money on a project is better than nothing at all, obviously. Like we will take the victory. But in many cases, it kind of pales in comparison to just traditional dual licensing alternatives, right? And in this space, I think it's illuminating that, you know, that reportedly early versions of NuGet contained payment capabilities that were stripped out before production, right? And it kind of shows that there are good people inside these organizations working hard to try and get people paid. And actually, I think it relies on the combined pressure of everyone that depends on this software to apply it to those organizations in order for them to realize that we want this too. So I think we need a bit more than just charity to fix this problem, I think is the truth. So thank you for listening. I know it's a bit short. Does anyone have any questions? Because often there's questions about this. Nothing? Are we mad at me or mad with me? Alongside, thank you. Thank you. Please, please, please get paid for the work you do and share all the good work. Honestly. Thank you very much.